The fires were still burning when he arrived. Thick black smoke rose from the tree line, mixing with the cold December air over the Belgian countryside. The ground was frozen solid, the roads were rivers of mud and ice, and somewhere ahead, through the haze and the wreckage, lay something his division desperately needed, something more valuable at that moment than guns, than men, than orders from Berlin. Fuel. Colonel Jochen Peiper moved through the chaos with the controlled calm of a man who had survived the Eastern Front twice. He was 30 years old, lean, hard, and decorated with enough medals to fill a coat. His SS Panzer regiment, Kampfgruppe Peiper, was the sharpest spear in Germany's last great gamble in the West, and right now that spear was running dry. It was December 1944. Hitler's massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes Forest, what the Allies would later call the Battle of the Bulge, was only days old. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition: smash through the weakest point in the American line, drive hard and fast to the port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies in two, force a peace deal before the Soviets crushed Germany from the east. The entire operation depended on speed, and speed depended on fuel. Peiper's column was one of the fastest armored groups in the German military. He had Tiger tanks, Panthers, half-tracks, artillery, and thousands of men. But those machines were thirsty. A single Tiger tank burned through fuel at a staggering rate, and the German supply lines, stretched thin, bombed constantly by Allied aircraft, strangled by years of Allied blockade, could barely feed them. Before the offensive began, Peiper had asked for fuel. He had been promised fuel. He had been told that captured American supplies would make up any shortfall. That promise was about to become the most important sentence of the entire offensive. Peiper pushed his column hard from the start, faster than the Germans beside him, faster than his flanks could keep up. He drove through the night, through fog, through forests so dense that the trees scraped the sides of his tanks. He left behind burning American vehicles, captured crossroads, stunned GIs who had expected a quiet sector. But the fuel gauges kept dropping. By the time he reached the small town of Stavelot on December 18th, Peiper's situation was becoming serious. His lead elements had crossed a bridge over the Amblev River, but American engineers had blown the next one. He was forced to reroute, to slow down, to recalculate. Every hour lost was an hour the Allies used to rush reinforcements to plug the gap. And then one of his scouts brought him news that changed everything, at least for a moment. Less than 2 miles away, across the river, sat a massive American fuel depot. The depot was located near a town called Stavelot. Some accounts point to the surrounding area near Spa, and it held something extraordinary. Reports indicated that the Americans had stockpiled fuel in that region in enormous quantities. Some estimates placed the total near 2 million gallons. Other accounts, more focused on what Peiper could actually reach, speak of a depot with roughly 50,000 gallons within striking distance of his column. 50,000 gallons of American fuel. For Peiper, this was the answer to every problem. Enough fuel to push his column all the way to the Meuse River. Enough to keep his tanks running. Enough, perhaps, to make Hitler's impossible dream come true. He ordered his men to move. What happened next lasted only a few hours, but inside those hours was a revelation that Peiper, one of the most decorated and ruthless officers in the Waffen-SS, would carry for the rest of his life. His men attacked toward the depot. American defenders, a thin screen of rear echelon troops and engineers, put up fierce resistance. The Germans pushed hard. The fighting was ugly and close, the kind of combat that turns towns into rubble and turns ordinary soldiers into heroes or ghosts. But before Peiper's men could seize the fuel, the Americans made a decision. They set it on fire. American soldiers, following standing orders about denying supplies to the enemy, began destroying the depot. Trucks were disabled, equipment was smashed, and the fuel, all of it or most of it, went up in flames. The sky above Stabilo turned orange. Peiper stood at a distance and watched, and in that moment something shifted inside him. He had fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. He knew what it looked like when a beaten army ran. He knew what panic looked like, what desperation looked like, what collapse looked like. He had seen armies crumble and men break. This was not that. The Americans had not panicked. They had not abandoned the fuel and fled. They had made a cold, calculated decision to deny it to the enemy, and then they had done it quickly and efficiently. No hesitation, no chaos, just discipline and purpose. Peiper understood immediately what that meant, because here was the thing that gnawed at him, that burrowed deeper than the loss of the fuel itself. The Americans could afford to burn it. The Germans could not afford to lose it. That was the difference. That was the gap, and it was not a gap you could close with courage or tactics or the will of the Führer. Germany had been running on fumes for 2 years, literally and figuratively. The Allied bombing campaign had hammered the oil refineries of Romania. The synthetic fuel plants inside Germany itself had been methodically destroyed from the air. Wehrmacht commanders on every front were rationing fuel, canceling training exercises, parking vehicles that would never move again. And here were the Americans, with so much fuel stockpiled across France and Belgium that they could light 50,000 gallons on fire rather than let the enemy have it. And not even blink.
Peiper had heard the propaganda. Every German soldier had. The Americans were soft. They were rich, spoiled, untested. They would break when pressed. They didn't have the stomach for real war. But the Americans Peiper had encountered in the Ardennes were not breaking. They were bending, yes. They were surprised, absolutely. The initial German assault had punched through the line and sent American units reeling. Towns had been lost. Entire regiments had been encircled. And yet, at the crossroads town of Bastogne, surrounded American paratroopers were refusing to surrender. When a German officer delivered a formal ultimatum to General Anthony McAuliffe demanding capitulation, McAuliffe read the note, crumpled it up, and reportedly told his staff, "Nuts." His official written reply was a single word, "nuts." The Germans, confused by American slang, eventually understood it to mean what it sounded like, defiance. At St. Vith, American engineers and tankers held out far longer than any reasonable defense should have allowed, buying time for Allied reserves to move. Everywhere Peiper's column went, it found resistance, improvised, desperate, sometimes terrifyingly thin, but resistance that cost him hours and kilometers and fuel he could not replace. And now the fuel depot was burning. Peiper pushed on. He had no choice. His orders were clear, his objective was the Meuse, and stopping meant defeat. His column snaked westward through the forest roads, his tanks grinding through ice and mud, his men cold and increasingly uncertain. But the momentum was bleeding away. Without the captured fuel, his column could not move as fast or as far as planned. He sent urgent messages back to his superiors. He needed resupply. He needed his flanks to keep pace. He needed bridges to be captured intact and roads to be clear. The replies he received were vague or delayed or filled with promises that never materialized. Peiper began to understand that he was alone at the tip of a spear that had no shaft. Meanwhile, the Allied response was accelerating in ways the Germans had not anticipated. General Dwight Eisenhower, supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, did not panic when the offensive began. He made a decision that many of his subordinates questioned at first. He told his generals that the German bulge in the line was not just a crisis, it was an opportunity. He turned Patton's Third Army 90 degrees in one of the most remarkable logistical pivots in military history and sent it charging north toward the surrounded troops at Bastogne. moving an entire army in winter conditions over frozen roads in just a few days was something most military planners would have said was impossible. Patton said 3 days, and he delivered. The roads behind the German lines, meanwhile, were becoming impossible. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, had promised to provide air cover for the offensive, but the Luftwaffe was a shadow of what it had been in 1940. Allied air power owned the skies. The moment the weather cleared, American and British fighter bombers descended on the German columns like a storm, hitting fuel trucks, supply convoys, tanks sitting on open roads waiting for gasoline that would never arrive. Peiper's column began to stall. His tanks ran low on fuel. His men were cut off, harassed from the air, and squeezed from multiple directions as American forces regrouped and counterattacked. The small Belgian villages that had watched German tanks roll through in the morning saw American infantry pushing back in the afternoon. On December 23rd, the weather broke, the skies cleared, and with that, the last real hope of the German offensive died. American C-47 transport planes filled the skies over Bastogne, dropping ammunition, food, and medical supplies to the surrounded paratroopers. American fighter bombers swept across the Ardennes, hunting German armor, destroying supply convoys, turning the roads into killing grounds. And Peiper, once the most feared commander in the offensive, the man Hitler had trusted to lead the breakthrough, found himself trapped. His column, reduced from hundreds of vehicles to a battered remnant, was surrounded in a small pocket around the town of La Glaise. He had almost no fuel, almost no ammunition. His tanks sat silent, useless, because there was nothing left to put in them. On Christmas night, 1944, Peiper made one final decision. He ordered his men to abandon their vehicles, to leave behind the tanks, the half-tracks, the artillery, everything that required fuel to move. Then he led roughly 800 survivors, on foot, in the freezing darkness, through the forest and back toward the German lines. He left behind over 100 vehicles. Dozens of tanks, including Tigers, sat silent and frozen in the Belgian snow, their fuel tanks empty. Some of the most powerful ground weapons in the world, rendered useless not by Allied firepower, but simply by the brutal arithmetic of supply and demand. When Peiper crossed back into German lines, he reported to his superiors. He was asked about the offensive, about the fuel, about the depot that had burned. What he said in the days and weeks that followed revealed a man who had looked directly at something and could no longer pretend he hadn't seen it. Peiper is reported to have described the American fuel reserves with a mixture of awe and despair. The quantity was overwhelming, the organization was extraordinary. These were not the signs of a nation struggling. These were the signs of a nation that had turned its industrial engine to full power and pointed it at Germany, and Germany had nothing that could match it. The fuel depot was a symbol, but symbols carry real weight. Germany had gone to war in 1939 with the assumption that speed and aggression could substitute for resources. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, worked when your enemy was unprepared and the campaign was short. But prolonged total war against an industrial giant was a different equation entirely. The United States produced more steel in a year than Germany could dream of. American factories were turning out tanks, planes, ships, jeeps, artillery, and ammunition at rates the German intelligence reports sounded like fiction, but were fact. American oil fields in Texas and Oklahoma and California were pumping fuel, while German oil sources had been bombed into ruin. And the Americans were shipping all of it, across the Atlantic, through the ports of France and Belgium, in quantities that simply could not be stopped.
Peiper had seen it with his own eyes, a depot so full that burning it was an acceptable tactical choice. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended in late January 1945. The German lines retreated back to where they had started. The offensive had cost Germany over 60,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured, along with hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, and irreplaceable quantities of fuel and ammunition that could never be replaced. The Americans suffered too, about 75,000 casualties in one of the bloodiest battles of the war in the West. But America had the reserves to absorb that loss. Germany did not. Within weeks of the offensive's failure, Soviet forces launched a massive winter offensive in the east, crashing through German lines and driving toward Berlin. American and British forces crossed the Rhine in March. Germany was being compressed from every direction. The fuel was gone, the tanks were gone, the men were gone, and the dream of a last great offensive in the West had turned to frozen ash in the Belgian snow. There is a particular kind of moment in war when a soldier or a commander stops believing in victory and simply begins surviving. Historians argue about when exactly Germany crossed that line, whether it was Stalingrad in early 1943 or the beaches of Normandy in June 1944 or the failure at the Bulge. But for Jochen Peiper, standing in the smoke-stained Belgian countryside, watching 50,000 gallons of American fuel burn into the winter sky, the line may have already been crossed. He wasn't watching fuel burn, he was watching the future burn. Because any man who understood logistics, and Peiper, whatever his many flaws and crimes, was a man who understood war, knew what that fire meant. It meant the Americans had so much that losing this amount didn't matter. It meant that somewhere else, in another depot, in another town, there were hundreds of thousands more gallons waiting. And somewhere beyond that, there were tankers crossing the Atlantic bringing millions more. Germany was fighting a nation that could afford to burn its excess and still win. The Battle of the Bulge is often remembered as a story of American heroism, of frozen paratroopers at Bastogne, of Patton's impossible turn, of GIs holding crossroads against overwhelming odds. And all of that is true, all of that deserves to be remembered. But it is also a story about something quieter and more fundamental. It is a story about what happens when industrial power, logistics, and national will combine into something that no offensive can break. The Germans came out of the Ardennes Forest with their best remaining armor, their most experienced commanders, and Hitler's personal conviction that one last great blow could change the outcome of the war. They found fuel depots so large that Americans could burn them as a tactical decision. They found supply lines so deep and resilient that cutting one simply caused the Americans to reroute through another. They found soldiers who were cold and scared and sometimes overrun, but who kept fighting, kept radioing for support, kept holding crossroads until help arrived. Peiper survived the war. He spent years in Allied custody, was tried for the massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy, one of the war's most infamous atrocities, committed by troops under his command, and eventually was released. He lived in France under a false name for years before being identified and killed in 1976 under circumstances that remain disputed. He never wrote a memoir, but those who spoke to him in the years after the war described a man who had no illusions about what had happened. He did not blame the generals or the weather or bad luck. He understood the arithmetic. Germany had been outweighed, not just in the end, but from the beginning. The Ardennes offensive was not a gamble that almost worked. It was a gamble that was always going to fail, because the thing it was gambling against, American industrial power, American fuel, American supply, was not something you could outmaneuver in the frozen forests of Belgium. You could capture a depot, you could hold it for a day, and then you could watch it burn. There is something worth sitting with in that image. A soldier standing in the cold, watching fire consume the fuel that could have saved his army, and understanding in that moment that it wouldn't have been enough anyway. Because here is the question that lingers long after the last tank runs dry and the last radio goes silent. When your enemy can afford to burn what you cannot afford to lose, what exactly are you fighting for? The soldiers in the snow knew the answer. even if no one in Berlin was ready to say it out loud.